I'm going to hand over to Annaliese now. She's going to bring you much more into the current and talk about the rights of asylum seekers and refugees and why they shouldn't be detained. And I look forward to your questions as we go. So over to you, Annaliese.
Thanks, Margie. Can everyone hear me all right? Great. Kia ora koutou. My name is Annaliese, and thanks everyone for joining us tonight. And thank you, Margie, for that really helpful historic overview. And I think to link into what you just said, I think what we have today is a dirty remnant of an awful policy which allows the detention of some asylum seekers in police stations and in our prisons. And to give a bit of context as to why Amnesty has done this research, this is an issue that Amnesty has been aware of for quite some time, but in recent years we saw an escalation in the harms and the allegations that we were receiving from lawyers, some of whom I see here tonight, and from our friends at the Asylum Seeker Support Trust. Some really serious cases of people who have come to New Zealand to seek a safe haven and instead have ended up in a prison, sometimes for days, sometimes for months, and sometimes for years. So the timeline of our research is between 2015 and 2020. And just to give you a quick a few details on how we do our research and why we're doing it. So this is actually the first human rights investigation of this type that Amnesty has carried out in New Zealand. And it sits within a broader program of work of people in detention. And so I think that reflects the seriousness of this as an issue and the real harms that it has for the people who are at the centre of it. And I'd just like to firstly acknowledge and honour the bravery of the people who have participated in this research. We talked to people who had come to New Zealand and thought that it was a safe place. And what we heard, myself and Meg Durand, who carried out these research interviews, is that instead they were met by a cruel system that placed them in a prison without committing any crime. And they were detained solely on immigration grounds. So our current legal system allows for this. So our Immigration Act allows for the detention of people who have sought asylum on immigration grounds in a police station and a prison. And the stories that they shared that were really brave and really heavy. So I hope that we will do them justice in the work that we're doing. And they are their stories. And yeah, I just want to honour that. And thank you also to the lawyers and the support workers and our friends over at the Asylum Seeker Support Trust, who we wouldn't have been able to do this work without, and continue to do amazing work on very limited resources every day. So that's a little bit of an introduction into the research. Before I go any further, I'm just going to take a step back and talk about the rights that are at the core of this, which is fundamentally the right to seek asylum and the right of people in detention. And the right to seek asylum reflects a commitment by the international community after the atrocities of World War II. So it's a long-standing universal human right, and it was the recognition that when people have to flee their home, they don't want to leave their home, but they're forced to. They may be persecuted on various different things. It might be political grounds, it might be basis on who they are and their identity, various reasons of why they might have to leave and take the arduous journey often to seek international protection. And in recognition of that, New Zealand is a member of the international community, and for several decades our government has committed to protecting that really important right to seek asylum. And that comes with various legal protections that we are meant to meet. And one of those things is that when you've left your home, often in great urgency, you may have to arrive in a country in a way that is not considered legal by that country. For example, you may not have a visa, for example. So you might turn up at the airport and you might have had to use a false passport. But the legal conventions, for example, the Refugee Convention, recognises that people who are fleeing persecution may have to use those things in order to find a safe home. So it actually recognises that. And that's really, really important. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why that's important, that we recognise that people sometimes have to use those ways to seek protection. The other thing is around people, if they are in detention, everyone in detention also has human rights. So when the state decides to detain someone, there are still obligations. And that includes that if you are in detention, you have the right to be treated with dignity. You have the right to be free from degrading or cruel treatment. You have the right to healthcare. So even if you are in detention, you still have rights as well. And I think that's really important to emphasise, because I think often in narratives around people seeking asylum or people in places of detention there can be an attempt to other them. But actually at its core, it's about everyone has dignity, and therefore we all have rights. So our research documents, I guess, the interaction between those different human rights and what they mean for people who have come here. So if someone is an asylum seeker, that means that they are going through a process, and that involves an application and a legal process. They're seeking to be recognised as a refugee. So that can sometimes take quite some time in New Zealand. But the people who we talked to, they tended to be detained through two main routes. So they might have arrived at the border, and they may have arrived, for example, on a false passport, or we also talked to people who arrived on a legitimate visa and were still detained. And the other route that people were detained was, for example, they might have come to New Zealand on a visa that might have expired, and they may have been discovered by immigration authorities. And at that point, they may have applied for asylum as well. And there's various reasons why people do that. It can be really complicated. But what we always come back to is that it's actually about seeing the person in front of you and allowing that person to go through this process where their claim is assessed fairly. And in prison, it's extremely difficult to do that. So that was something that we heard from lawyers as well, was that when someone is detained in a prison cell and is really unwell, they can't get access to their first language, it's really, really difficult to progress an asylum claim. I'm going to take us a little bit on the journey that people face. So I'm going to give the example of airport arrival. So this is an example. You'll see in our report the various case studies that were featured of people who have bravely shared their stories with us. But this is kind of a general example. So you've fled persecution, you might have suffered great violence, torture, and you arrive at Auckland Airport and you get off that plane and you're exhausted, you're probably traumatised, you're hoping that finally this is a safe place for you and that someone will hear your story and in good faith assess your asylum claim. Instead, you'll refuse entry to New Zealand, and what Immigration New Zealand calls these cases is turnaround or deportation claims. you refuse entry, and so you don't necessarily have any legal status in New Zealand, and you say, hey, I'm here to claim asylum, I need to tell someone my story, you're then taken to a room. You don't have a lawyer, you do have a translator, but you don't have a lawyer, and you're interviewed by border officials about why you are here, the fact that you do want to make an asylum claim, but also various questions asked about the risk that you may pose. And one of the questions that can be asked is, for example, will you leave New Zealand if your claim is declined? And that was something that really shocked us, because you can't win in that situation. If you say, no, of course, I can't go home, I could die, that is then used as a ground to say that you are at risk of escaping within New Zealand and that you won't be able to be deported. And if you say yes, then your asylum claim will fail, because you're not considered as having a well-founded fear of persecution. So you arrive at the airport, you're interviewed by officials, and then a police officer may turn up. And at that point, you may be taken, sometimes in handcuffs, to a police station. And at that point, the law enables someone to be detained for 3 to 4 nights. So we heard some pretty shocking things of what happens in those police stations for people who are detained there for those 3 or 4 nights. And once you've been there, you'll be taken to court. And the law does require that a judge signs off on what we call a warrant of commitment, which is a court order for detention. But this is really, really quick. And usually you're only represented by what we call a duty lawyer, and that's generally a criminal lawyer. And I think it's really important to say here, again, these people have not committed a crime in New Zealand, but they're going through what is essentially a criminal process. If the judge agrees with immigration that you should be in prison, and the grounds that are able to be used for detaining people is they generally relate to questions of identity, what is seen as a threat to absconding, or broad grounds relating to a security question that the New Zealand government might have. So those are some of the grounds that are used. You're then taken again, potentially in handcuffs, and you're admitted into a prison. And I think a really important point to highlight here is, under our current system, immigration detainees, whether that's someone who is seeking asylum or someone who is a migrant and doesn't have legal status, but the immigration agency is seeking to deport, they are treated and classified as accused remand prisoners, and that is the language that is used. So when you're admitted to a prison as an immigration detainee, that prison may have no idea what you have been through, and that you have not committed a crime in New Zealand. And what you'll see in the report, I'm not going to go into too much into it now, but the risks and the harms that poses for people once they are in prison, they're double bunked, they're subject to the same regimes that we see causing harms to other people in our New Zealand prisons at the moment. So what we've found from our research is this whole process puts asylum seekers at serious risks, and our research does conclude that in some cases constitute serious human rights violations. And so we will be providing more information about that next week when we release our research. But for now, I will pass over back to Margaret, who is going to talk a little bit more about how you can be involved. So the overall call that our research and our campaign will be asking of the New Zealand government, particularly the Immigration Minister, is to end the use of criminal justice facilities of people seeking asylum in New Zealand. So that's our broader call, and our report will also make a number of other recommendations for reforming the system. So thanks, Margaret, and I'm happy to answer questions later as well.
Great, thanks, Annaliese. So, as we do with many of our campaigns, what we work very hard to do is to ensure that the people that we ask to campaign with us, to take action with us, are informed and feeling confident about the asks that we make. So we're going to start with, because we do want to change the narrative out there about why asylum seekers are detained, but also what an asylum seeker is, and be able to give you the opportunity to answer the questions that you might be posed when you go out to your communities. And that's why we are recording this session, because what we're really keen to do is to ensure that you are resourced and armed, you are informed, and then you can start having conversations with those easy people in your lives, your friends, your family, those people that are more likely to think like you do and could be easy to practice on. But actually, if we are to have the change that we want to have, and we do plan to win this campaign, we always plan to win every campaign that we run. And if we are to change the narrative, then we are going to have to widen the level of knowledge about the detention of asylum seekers in New Zealand, but what we can do about it. Because the other thing that Amnesty International consistently does is offer sane, humane solutions to issues out there. And we will be talking to the government about that. So one of the things that we will be asking, we would love each and every single one of you to circulate our petition. We will be looking for 10,000 signatures on a petition that we will hand over to the New Zealand government, that demanding an end to this practice. But we also want people like you to go out there and build the community of support for this campaign. So yes, of course, you'd start with friends and family. But for those of you who are at school, then we would encourage you to have the conversations with your school groups. And for instance, the Freedom Challenge theme, our annual youth leadership event every year. This year, the focus will be on the detention of asylum seekers in New Zealand. We are asking all our university groups to outreach to fellow students, but also to outreach to academics with a body of knowledge or expertise that we can draw on. As we get into the campaign, we would love every team to host an event that will raise awareness, raise knowledge, and encourage action in this campaign. And every step of the way, we will be resourcing you. We plan to have a resource kit ready to go for when the campaign launches. And that will include everything from having conversations with friends and family, but also taking those next steps, organising meetings with your MP and having conversations with the decision makers as well. Picking up the phone and ringing the Minister of Immigration, Chris Papoi, and letting him know that we, ordinary everyday New Zealanders, are deeply concerned by this practice and we want it to end. And to help us do that, we've planned a roadshow that is going to go around the country, and that will be launched at our annual Hui and Skillshare, which is going to take place in Christchurch. Is going to be, we are blessed to have Beiruz Buchani as a keynote speaker, but we will be discussing this campaign there, and we will be teaching our advocates, our youth advocates, how to have the conversations and ways to have winning conversations that will get people convinced about the need to take action with us. So we've got a body of work that we plan to do. But also, as I said right at the very beginning, this is going to be an organic campaign that is going to rely heavily on your shoulders as ordinary, everyday Kiwis out in your community. And if you've got questions, we need to hear them so that we can be ready to answer them and make sure, because if you've got them, others will have too, and we want to make sure that we've got the answers for all those questions. So there's a whole body of work that's happening, and the other area that we know that we can be really powerful on is in social media. So whether you're active on Facebook or Instagram or on Twitter, you can help us amplify our message by following, liking, and commenting on our posts. But you can also most powerfully share our posts to help amplify our message. And we'll be encouraging you to do that, but also in the workshops that we undertake, highlighting ways to be more effective, to have more human rights impact on our social media feeds. So that's very much going to be part of a journey that we take together. And whichever community you inhabit, whether it's a faith community, whether it's an academic community, whether it's a sporting community, whether it's a book club, we believe that there's a place for this campaign where you are comfortable to take this campaign. So our challenge to you is to step up and take this campaign as widely as possible, because we're not talking necessarily about big numbers, but we are talking about profound impact and profound damage on human beings who all they've done is come to New Zealand to say, I'd like to find a refuge. I'm looking for safety here. So would very much welcome your support for all that. I think that's it from me. There are I've got a few questions here. So I might just start with some of the questions. So from Jack Byrne, what is the Minister of Immigration's and Government's likely deflecting response? And will the resource kit debunk that? Is, e.g., is there any way they can say the incidence of detention is reducing? Over to you, Annaliese, I think.
Yeah, great question. Thanks, Jack. I mean, I think ultimately we don't know yet, because we haven't launched yet. But in terms of what my understanding is from our conversations we've had so far, is a common deflection is that it's very small numbers, and that therefore it's okay. And I think our response to that has always been, every one of those people matter, and every one of those people, even if it is small numbers, they still have rights, even if it's complicated cases, which is often a line that's used as well. Complicated doesn't mean that you're not a human being. And so that's will be our response. So yes, the majority of asylum seekers who come to New Zealand, they're not detained in any way, but I think the harms that we've seen in terms of the use of this policy is that it's significant, and it shouldn't be happening. So that will probably be one of the responses, and it's probably helpful if others are asked around that as well. I think it's bringing it back to they're still human beings, they still have rights, and we shouldn't be using prisons and police stations.
Great. So Dorothy from Dunedin has asked, would be good to know where we envisage asylum seekers being put, if not in prison, in light of number of Kiwis with nowhere to live.
Yeah, another great question. So there's actually a significant number of options available in terms of that are not prisons and police stations. So that, for example, that does require adequate resourcing as well. That's definitely true. But, you can be really, movement can still be restricted. There might be some cases where it might be legitimate to restrict some movement, but that can be in the community. So, for example, the Asylum Seeker Support Trust, they host people at their hostel, and there's certain conditions around that, but they need to be adequately resourced. So community-based alternatives need to be adequately resourced. There's also options, for example, at the Mangere Resettlement Centre. There's also internationally, there's plenty of alternatives. And I think what we always come back to is that liberty should always be the starting point. And it always, whilst immigration detention is not completely prohibited, we shouldn't be using prisons, we shouldn't be using police stations, and there are alternatives that we do have to adequately resource. And again, with the line that it's small numbers, well, that means we can, I think we can crack this pretty well. We just need to make sure that the alternatives are available, and we know as well that communities and others have offered to host people who have been detained, and that's been declined by the government. So those options are also already exist in the community but aren't necessarily being utilised.
And I think that might have answered your question, Anna. But if it hasn't, can you just get back to me again? But having said that, because there's quite a flurry of questions here, the next question is from Amandi. This is quite specific, but I am just wondering what the stats are on the people we do detain. Have we ever detained children? Additionally, what would happen to a child if their parent was detained?
Can you repeat that question, Margie?
Sure. And it has to do, it's specific to the statistics on asylum seekers. And I'm just looking back there, sorry, my darling. Here we go. What are the stats on the people we do detain? Have we ever detained children? Additionally, what would happen to a child if their parent was detained?
In the last 2 decades, I think my understanding is we haven't detained children, but don't quote me on that. I think that's something we could go and ask and double check for you. The law does allow, though, in some cases for that to happen, whilst immigration says that it shouldn't in their operational instructions. The law does actually still allow that. So I think that's something, it's a protection that needs to be in the law.
Mm-hmm. Ashley from the Hawke's Bay Regional Team, is there a theme with the people who are being detained? Are they all men? Do they come from specific countries, entry types, etc.?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we're pretty cautious at Amnesty in making 2 blanket statements, so I can only comment on the contents of our research, but they predominantly are men. Yep. And they're mostly from countries that are experiencing some form of serious conflict. So we'll talk a little bit more about the profile of people we've interviewed in our report. Yeah.
Okay, and others have asked a related question, so hopefully that's covered it. I'm thinking of you there, Hamish. Gayleen and Ian, the question from you guys is, will you look at the disparity between quota and convention refugees? After gaining asylum and now convention refugees must apply for work visa and residency. This process is very long.
Yeah, absolutely. That's definitely something that has come up in our work, and we totally agree there needs to be quite significant reform in that area. It is outside the scope of this current research, but we do talk about the economic and social inequalities around how we treat asylum seekers and convention refugees and those who have arrived under our quota system, in terms of briefly the impacts post-prison. So what it looks like to live in the shadow of prison. We briefly touch on that in our research, but it's absolutely, when we talk about treating people with dignity, that comes into that. So I'd love to see more work on that, potentially by others as well. It's definitely an area that needs more work. Okay.
Joanne Wilkes, are we after the repeal of the order that went out on September the 19th, 2001? It was an operational instruction rather than an order, or just an abandonment of its use? Is it legislation?
So we're seeking the reform of the Immigration Act, and specifically ending the use of criminal prisons and police stations. We're also making a variety of further recommendations to the Immigration Act. And I think what's really important about that is operational instructions are useful, but ultimately, if we have legislation that still enables these practices, we have to change that.
And Alejandra has asked, Kia ora kato, thanks for sharing this preview. Since I'm myself conducting research on interpreting services for refugees and asylum seekers, I wanted to ask, what are your findings in terms of use of interpreters after the initial interview at the airport, i.e. if the right to effective communications has been upheld in police stations, prisons, etc. I'm not sure if you can share this information at this stage, but thank you anyway.
Thank you. That sounds like some fantastic research. Yeah, I probably can't go into the details of the findings, so wait and see for the report, but there's definitely some content around issues with language barriers at all stages of the process, particularly in police stations and in the prison as well.
Great. And just so we here at Amnesty are aware, there have been some concerns raised about putting asylum seekers in Mangere, as most refugees in Mangere are recognised and about to be resettled. So those comments are from you, Amur, and from you, Sue. Thank you. They have been noted. And because it wasn't a question there, I'm not planning to pose them, but we are documenting everything we receive. So just bear with us while we draw on the good information you've given us. Amanda, though, has asked another question about, do we know how expensive it is to detain individual asylum seekers? Surely it is more expensive to host them in prisons than to adequately resource organisations like the Asylum Seeker Support Trust.
Amen.
Indeed. Okay. Sorry, there's such a flurry of questions. I'm struggling to stay on top of them. Just bear with me. Okay, this is from Anna. Re-initial interview. Did I hear correctly that it usually happens with interpreter, but no lawyer in capitals? That seems so out of line with normal New Zealand law, especially if the interaction is being treated otherwise under a criminal law approach.
Yeah, unfortunately you did hear right. So in terms of generally at the airport, that initial interview, usually lawyers are not present, and what you'll see in our report is the impacts of that.
Right, okay. You've discussed, this is from James Ibel Roberts, you have discussed the themes and the backgrounds of asylum seekers that are detained based on your research, e.g. men from countries experiencing conflict. What justification does the government, Immigration New Zealand, give for detaining these individuals and not others? Does Immigration New Zealand recognise, acknowledge that they are detaining asylum seekers of particular backgrounds?
Yeah, so usually the grounds that I use, there might be a question, for example, around identity. They may justify it on grounds relating to risk of what they call absconding. So, for example, they may believe that someone, they won't be able to deport someone if their claim fails. That's really problematic for a whole lot of reasons. And the grounds are quite broad, and what you'll see, how we kind of lay out in the report, is the process that people go through. They can't necessarily defend those claims made against them in a meaningful way. So I think there's definitely more questions to be asked around the grounds that we are using for detention in terms of the Immigration Act. Okay.
So Amur has asked another really great question. There have also been asylum seekers who are trans women detained in prison in the male population. Trans people are a lot less likely to have proper and recognisable IDs, and being detained in the wrong gender population is incredibly dangerous and harsh. Any initiative to work with the groups advocating for trans women in prison?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that's can be incredibly dangerous. In our other work on detention, that's something that we know other groups are in supporting other groups who are advocating on those issues, but would love to talk to you more about it if you want to send us an email afterwards.
I think that's all the questions. Others will have, there's quite a lot of comment there from people, and one of the lovely things about this call is there's a whole heap of expertise, whether that be Joanna, who's a practicing refugee lawyer, or Sue, who goes way back when it comes to asylum seeker and refugee rights. So you're exactly the people that we need on this call and beyond. We're going to count on every single one of you to help us to bring this campaign home. So we are documenting all these comments. So thank you for your interest and your passion. We are going to work alongside you. Another question though from Anna. In Christchurch, sorry to chime in again, but curious if Amnesty research has included any survey of attitudes and knowledge amongst the personnel involved, including airport, customs, police, etc. Do we have visibility re how aware everyone involved is about the legality of asylum seeking?
No, we haven't, Anna, but we do make some recommendations specifically around the training of people involved in various stages of the process. So, right from the very beginning, those border officials, and when there's high levels of discretion of state power, that's when we see problems. But even at the district court level as well. So, and essentially we're using a criminal justice system for this. So even the duty lawyers at the district court or the judges, they're used to seeing cases come through their doors that are primarily criminal in nature. So that's definitely an area of concern.
Right, okay. Some useful comment, and again from Amandi, just to add Immigration New Zealand's justification of detaining people under the Immigration Act. Immigration New Zealand is not subject to the Human Rights Act and therefore wouldn't face sanctions for violating the Act. But against the excuse of security grounds, lawyers and Tim from the Asylum Seeker Support Trust have just basically said, what a load of rubbish. That's an excuse. So, that's something that we can push back on strongly as well. And we are very much looking forward to working alongside Tim and his great team at Asylum Seeker Support Trust. They have just given us such great access, but first-hand accounts. And if you can, please check out the Asylum Seeker Support Trust website and support them in their great mahi as well. Okay, so Amar has said, Jack and I are part of the group Rainbow Path for Asylum Seekers and Refugees. Great, thanks, Jack. We've got that email, we'll document that. And we're also a great friend, Eliana, who for many might not know, but some of you will. Wonderful Eliana was the first trans refugee to be accepted into New Zealand and has only ever been a gift to this country with her incredible kororo on the rights of trans people. And I believe she's so powerful that the rest of the world is very much listening to her as well. So look forward to working with you, Amo and Jack from the Rainbow Path community. I think that's all the questions I've received, and which is just about 5 minutes before we are to end. Unless there are any other questions. Anyone coming in? Okay. Right, I think that's all the questions I'm receiving. Again, all I can do is reiterate our Amnesty New Zealand's great thanks to everybody on this call. just in this call alone, there is huge passion and expertise, and we are very keen to work alongside you and work with you. I'm just going to hand back to Annaliese in case she's got any last thoughts or adds to say, and then we can finish this call.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate Margaret's thanks, and it's really fantastic to see people on the call who've been involved in this really intimately. So thank you for joining. And again, I just want to honour the people that we talked to and for sharing their story, and I hope that we can make some real change here with all of your help.